welcome everyone. And I'm Stacey Davis. I'm going to be your host for today. So welcome back. This is the second session. If you're new to us, awesome. But the session coming up is the joys and challenges of working with wild spaces, part 2. If you weren't able to catch the first one, you can always hop on later and view the recording. As we go through the session today, don't forget to use the chat feature on the right side of the screen. Just throw in questions and comments as the presenter goes along, and at the end we'll have some time to answer questions there. So now I'd like to welcome Chris Helzer to present the joys and challenges of working with wild spaces, part 2. Chris is the director of science for the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska, where he conducts research and evaluates prairie management and restoration work. He's also dedicated to raising awareness of the values of prairies through his photography, writing, and presentations. Chris is the author of the Prairie Ecologist blog, which has fantastic photos and also good information as well. And he has written 2 books, The Ecology and Management of Prairies in the Central U.S. and Hidden Prairie, Photographing Life in 1 Square Meter. I really feel like I need to see that one, Chris. Chris is also a frequent contributor to Nebraska Land magazine, as well as other publications. And Chris and his family live in Aurora, Nebraska. So welcome, Chris, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Great, thank you. Good to see everybody, except that I don't see anybody. I just see my own reflection in my screen. I'm going to talk about land management. I want to start out with a little bit of a pep talk, maybe, because land management is hard. There are lots of challenges that we face every day that kind of stack on top of each other and can feel like they sort of beat us down repeatedly to the point where it can be really frustrating sometimes and hard to keep moving forward. And it doesn't help that people around us don't really understand what it is we're doing, maybe, or what we're trying to accomplish, and trying to explain in one short burst all the things that we're trying to do and why it can be really difficult. But I think one thing that helps me keep things in perspective and feel better is to remember that the work we're doing today is part of the generation that we're in, which is one link of a really long chain of stewards that has been going on for a long time and will continue to go on for a long time. So the prairies of North America, for example, have been managed by people since the last ice age ended and prairies arrived on the scene in North America. So indigenous people managed prairies for a lot of years, very intentionally, very thoughtfully, and are still continuing to do it today. Those of us who aren't indigenous are also managing land. And 50 years, 100 years, 500 years from now, people will still be managing the land. And all we have to do is kind of do our job to continue that. And another way to think about it would be, if you saw my earlier talk, or if you've seen me talk about this before, this will be a repeat, but it'll be short, I promise, and then I'm going to build on it. When we do restoration work, I think it's not appropriate to think about it in terms of restoring a historic building or like an antique car where there's a final product that's very defined. Instead, the work that we do with restoration is more like restoring a city after a disaster, right? Where services and function is what matters. So housing and food and transportation. We want people to survive and thrive. So the final product is very flexible because we care about how it works, not how it looks. And the reason I bring that up now is that I think when we get into land stewardship, it's like city management, where it's still about services. The managers of a city, the people in charge of making a city run, are worried about those services and making sure that people have places to live and places to work and can play their role in the community so that the entire community survives. And then a lot of that management is really about facilitating adaptation, right? As the world changes around us, our cities the places where we live have to adapt. So we change our infrastructure to be more modern. And we manage sort of the evolution and change of the people and the communities that live within the city. And that really is, I think, a pretty good analogy or a metaphor for what we're doing with ecological stewardship. We're facilitating the adaptation by those communities. And then again, there's no end point, right? There isn't a final point. There isn't a defined point at which we say, okay, now we've got it. Now we can walk away, right? And I think that's one of the things that the public doesn't understand very well is I'm sure you get the same question. People always ask, like, so at what point can you just like sort of back off and let nature do its thing, right? That's just not a reality. And so that the point about there being no finished product, I think, is really helpful, because what it means is, and this is really important, we don't have to fix the natural world. We don't have to fix these places. What we need to do is keep it operational. And to me, that's a really helpful way to frame this, because again, we're just one link in this long chain of stewards. And so our job is to keep it operational so we can hand it off to the next generation and they can take it from there. So we do the best we can to facilitate adaptation and to upgrade our infrastructure and our way of doing things, to modernize them. And then we just hand it off to the next generation. So I don't know if that helps you. It helps me. I thought I'd share it. So facilitation. Resilience is all about adaptation. It's about the capacity of communities to adapt. And there are ways that we can manage that will help with that resilience. But I want to start out by sort of defining what I mean by resilience when I'm talking about this, because I'm talking about ecological resilience. And if you've heard terms like multiple stable states or state and transition models, that's all sort of in that same realm. It's the same topic. And it's different than engineering resilience or other kinds of resilience. So from an engineering standpoint, resilience is the way it has to do with equilibrium. So if you have a pendulum and you push that pendulum, the resilience is measured by when and how it comes back to the starting point. So there's a fixed point here, where it doesn't work with prairies or other ecological systems, because we don't have that sort of same point. So if we push a prairie in a certain direction with a management strategy or with drought, we don't necessarily expect it to come back and look exactly like it did before, because that's not how ecological systems work. So I think a better way of thinking about ecological resilience is with the idea of a ball and a bowl. So the ball being the prairie and the bowl being this stability domain, or this range of stability. And the idea here is that you have a ball rolling around in this big bowl, and it gets pushed around by fire, grazing, drought, mowing, anything that happens to it, invasive species to some extent. And it gets pushed around in the bowl, but as long as it stays within the bowl, it's still a prairie. It still has that integrity as itself. It's still the same kind of ecological system. If it gets pushed too hard, though, it can leave the bowl and it becomes something else that has its own set of resilience, but it's in a different place. It's a different state now. It exists in a different state. And it's really difficult to go backwards. So a couple examples. If you take a prairie and you transition it to a crop field, that's a very different state now, right? And it's really difficult, as we know, to reverse that and go back from a crop field back to a prairie. It can be done to some extent, but it takes an incredible amount of work and energy to do it. And then we still don't get what we had before. The same thing can happen with woody encroachment. At some point, you stop having a prairie with trees and you start having a woodland with openings. And a woodland with openings has a very different habitat and a very different ecological system than a prairie. And it might be okay, or it might not be okay, depending on what your objectives are, but it is definitely different. And it can be really hard to reverse that and get back to where you were before. I think it gets a little more complicated when we talk about degradation of a prairie. So if you have a site that has lost a lot of its plant and animal species, for example, it's also lost a lot of the productivity and the function that sort of defined that ecological system. And at some point, I think it degrades far enough that it is now something completely different. So it's been pushed out of that bowl, and it may be resilient as what it is, but it's not still in the same bowl as a diverse prairie that maybe we would have liked to have or that we used to have. And by the way, the reason I think that's true is that I've seen it happen. I've seen prairies that change dramatically and don't look very good depending on your point of view, for a few years. And then a few years later, they look kind of back like they did before, or similar to what they did before. But I've also seen prairies that have lost a lot of those species. And no matter what we do in terms of management, they just never sort of circle back around to where we were hoping they would go. So the point of all of this is, as land managers, our job really is to keep the ball in the bowl. We're trying to manage these sites and these systems so that they maintain resilience, they stay within that regime of stability. But again, that doesn't mean that they look the same every year. They can be really variable in terms of what species are most abundant in some years, or in terms of the habitat structure that's being provided, but they're still within that same regime. And of course, it's not just like a bowl that goes to another bowl. These stability regimes, there's lots of different possibilities of where a system could go if it gets pushed out of its or past its own threshold. So in some ways, it's almost like a ball in an egg carton, if you want to push that analogy that far. Okay, so with all that said, how do we get resilience, and how do we keep it? I think there's three pillars here that are important. The first is species diversity, because every species plays a different role, a little bit of a unique role in an ecosystem. And there's a lot of redundancy, or there can be a lot of redundancy between those roles, those species, but they're all a little bit different too. And so it's important to have all of them, or as many as we can, both because of the uniqueness of them, but also because of the redundancy. And if you lose a species for a while, if a species can't play its job or play its role for a little bit, there are other species that can kind of fill in there, as long as you have a wide range of species there. The second one is habitat size, and the redundancy of habitat fits in here too. So because they're tied together, right? If a large piece of habitat, a large patch of habitat contains a lot of animals, which means populations are bigger. You might have multiple populations, and that adds that resilience, because if part of the population gets hurt by a disease or a management impact or a drought or something like that, it's unlikely that the entire population will disappear if it's big enough. And the habitat redundancy fits in here because if you have a large enough habitat, you're probably going to have multiple examples of wet areas or south-facing dry slopes, or whatever a habitat, individual habitat type might be. The larger area you have, the more redundancy you're going to have probably of each of those little micro habitats. And then the third is connectivity of habitat. And that can be the same thing as habitat size if you have a huge block of land and it's all connected because it's all one block, but it also can be taken care of by different kinds of connections, where you might have multiple patches of habitat that are somehow connected together by road ditch habitat, or maybe you do a restoration project to reconnect them together. Or for some species, of course, they're mobile enough that they can hopscotch over things that aren't necessarily their favorite habitat. But species diversity, and then the size and connectivity of habitat, really, I think, are the major pillars that build ecological resilience in these sites that we're working with. So to promote that, the first thing, of course, is to protect the habitat we have, because if we can just sort of stop the bleeding and keep habitats from becoming more fragmented, that's awesome. We can restore habitats that have been fragmented, and we can do that with trying to be strategic in terms of the location, so that we're doing restoration next to or between existing habitat patches, so they actually do function as larger pieces. And we can do that by doing the best job we can to use the high diversity seed mixes, and then to manage those sites well, which leads into the third one, which is the stewardship piece. And that's what I'm going to focus on now for the rest of this talk, is the stewardship piece. And again, even here, we're trying to manage for that diversity of species that we have. And we're going to try to make sure that that diversity stays by managing the habitat of all those different species, hopefully, because every species has its own unique habitat needs. So to start out, let's talk a little bit about objectives, or about visions or goals. What are you trying to do with a piece of land that you're managing? Because there's not a wrong answer here. There's a lot of good answers. Most of the sites that I manage, we're aiming for this top piece, this ecological resilience, everything I've just talked about. We tend to have the habitat patches that I manage tend to be fairly large in size, blocks of habitat that are a couple hundred acres to a couple thousand acres or bigger in size, where we have some decent chances of having viability. And we've done a lot of restoration work to try to build up that size. But there are sites that tend to be smaller or even bigger sites where the key objective might be that we have this population or a few populations of rare plants or rare animals on this place that don't exist other places or don't exist in very many other places. And it's fine to prioritize for those. It can be really challenging because if you manage for the needs of those species, you can manage against the needs of other species, and you can have it can result in the sort of the whole community falling apart in a way that ends up hurting the species you're managing. But it's still a fine objective to have. Or you might have other objectives like pollinators or grassland birds. Or you might say that you're managing a site because you're trying to connect people in nature. And so the objective is to manage it in a way where people feel like it's an attractive, safe, accessible place to come and visit and have a good time. That also is very valid. And there's lots of other options here. Another thing to think about then is, what are the trade-offs that you're willing to consider as you think about your particular site? Because, for example, if you want both plant diversity and animal diversity, those two are not always going to be, the management you do for one might not be the management for the other. And there are always conflicts between what some species need and what other species need. So what I mean by trade-offs here is, are you willing to have a smaller population or fewer populations of some species in order to have more species overall, and hopefully have a larger amount of resilience in the community? Because again, this is a question there's not a right answer to. It's just a really important thing to think about as you think about what your management is and what you're aiming for. So what I'm going to talk about here is, again, this bigger picture idea of managing for ecological resilience. Toward the end, I'm going to talk about how to adapt some of this for smaller sites or more fragmented sites. But I want to start out with kind of best case scenario, which is species diversity in a large habitat. And the way that we think about this, the way I think about this, is that habitat heterogeneity drives species diversity, and species diversity drives ecological resilience, assuming that we have the size and connectivity of habitat. And so when I talk about habitat heterogeneity, I'm talking about the fact that in grasslands, people that aren't grassland people tend to think of grasslands as like one monotonous or homogeneous structure type, right? It's not like forests. Forests have canopy trees and subcanopy and herbaceous layers and all these things. Well, grasslands have that same kind of habitat structure. It's just a little bit more condensed. So you can have tall, dense vegetation. You can have patchy vegetation with openings in between. You can have uniformly short vegetation. And then you can have these really crazy habitat types where maybe the grass is being kept short by grazers, for example, and you've got a bunch of tall forbs growing up in the middle of them, and that can look in a lot of different ways. And that last example of the short grass, tall forbs, I think is difficult to make without grazing animals, because in some ways, grazing animals can be habitat artists, and we can utilize the selectivity of their grazing to manipulate that habitat structure in some really interesting ways, in ways that I'm not sure we can do other ways. Because if you look at this picture, how else would you get that structure where little animals have a chance to run around on the ground without running through dense vegetation, but still have overhead cover? Insects can move from shade to sun really quickly. Reptiles and amphibians have that same ability. The only other way to do this, I think, would be if you're really artistic and have a lot of time with a weed whacker. Maybe you could make this kind of habitat, but it's not really a very feasible habitat management strategy, I think, for most of us. But I'm also not here to advocate for grazing. I'm just showing examples of different types of habitat structure, and we'll talk about different ways to make that happen. So why does it matter? Why do we need all of those different variations and more of habitat structure? And the reason is that species have different needs, right? So from a bird standpoint, upland sandpipers tend to like short, sparse habitat on large patches. Henslow sparrows are almost on the other extreme, where some shrubbiness is fine. A lot of standing dead material and heavy thatch can be really helpful for Henslow sparrows. But the same thing happens with insects. There are insects that have contrasting needs, and there are plant species that have contrasting needs, both in terms of habitat structure and sort of the growing conditions that they face or that they live in. So if we want to have all of those species, one way to do that is this sort of idea or this model of a shifting mosaic of habitat patches, in which you have all of those different habitat types that we talked about, and they're spread across the prairie, So there's patches of each of them all the time, but then over time they sort of shift around so that they're in different places. You have this system of, or this uh, system of sort of disturbance, recovery, rest that kind of bubbles up in different places, like you're cooking a big stew. So here's an example, really broad example of short habitat and tall habitat on different sides of a fence. That's part of what I'm talking about here. Here's an aerial photo, though, of a site that shows it a little bit better, where there's at least 4 different types of habitat patches here on this one site, where there's an area that's being intensively grazed. It's very short and sparse habitat. There's an area that is more patchily grazed, where there's a lot more structure, but there's a lot of openings in between. There's some areas that are recovering from an intensive grazing a year ago, where it's really full of wildflowers and sort of short-lived opportunistic wildflowers, especially. And then you've got other areas where the habitat is tall and dense and thatchy. It's kind of a Henslow sparrow type habitat. And then the next year, all of these are in different places because the intensively grazed area goes into a recovery phase and a rest period, and everything sort of shifts around. That's the idea. So here's some examples of what it can look like on the ground, just so you can visualize this. Here's a site that was in a patch burn grazing system, which is one way to do a shifting mosaic. It's not the only way, but it's one possibility. And in this case, this site was burned in the spring, grazed all summer. And by the time late July came around and we were in kind of a flash drought, the grasses that had been grazed over and over and over all summer basically went dormant when the drought came. Some of the wildflowers were grazed, some of them were not. Some were grazed and still flowered, some were grazed all the way to the ground. A real hodgepodge of things. But this is a particular habitat type. Here's that same exact site a year later. So it's still alive, first of all. And you get this big party of forbs that happens the year after that grazing at our sites, where the grasses here, this is a July photo, and you see big bluestem and Indian grass and switchgrass and a bunch of tall grass species in this photo, but they're only about 8 or 10 inches tall. And they're not very competitive against all these other wildflowers, which get to flourish in the absence of that strong competition from grasses. And then just across the fire break in the area that wasn't burned the previous year, you have a much denser habitat. Grasses are much taller. Some different wildflowers are blooming. Some of the same wildflowers are blooming, but they're at a different abundance. So it's just a real variation on the types of habitat that can be out there. So again, I'm not advocating for any particular approach here. Patch burn grazing is one way to do a shifting mosaic, where you have an area that's not cross-fenced. You just burn a different piece, and then the cattle respond to that, or the bison respond to that, whatever your grazers are. And they're going to graze the most recently burned area. And then the areas that were burned further ago, longer ago, get to go through this recovery and rest period. It can be really great for habitat heterogeneity. It's really great from a livestock standpoint also, because they've got the opportunity to go wherever they want to find the food that they want to eat. And it can be reasonably good for controlling woody vegetation because you have a fairly decent frequency of fire. But that is really variable. So in some places that might not be frequent enough to control woody vegetation. Other places it's sufficient. I want to show you another example, just again to kind of highlight the idea here that there are multiple ways to do this. I'm going to talk about grazing methods first, but I'm also going to talk later about ways to do it without grazing, because you don't have to have grazers to make this work. But one of the things we see in Nebraska is that we don't have a strong fire culture among our ranching community at this point. And so the idea of using patch burn grazing is attractive from a production standpoint, maybe. But most ranchers, if they buy into that piece, still just can't make the logistics work. They can't burn frequently enough to drive a system with fire. And so we're trying to come up with other ways to create that same heterogeneity. And one of the ways we're experimenting with right now is called the open gate rotation system. That's what we're calling it. But in a typical rotation system, you move cows from pasture A to pasture B to pasture C across the season. In this example, what we do is we graze pasture A for a while, and when it gets short, we open the gate to pasture B, but we leave the gate open. And what happens is cattle, in this case, will move into the second pasture and they'll start grazing there, but they keep returning to the first pasture because the regrowth of the grasses from the earlier grazing is the most nutritious available forage. So the grass and the other plants too, to some extent, but once they've been grazed, they put out new growth again, And that new growth is what the most nutritious forage is that those cows are looking for. So we can allow them more space to graze and more choices, but we still have access to that first patch because of that regrowth. And then later in the season, if we want, we can open up another pasture, and you can do this with as many pastures as you want. But you're sort of like just opening up a pressure relief valve when the grazing pressure gets to the point where you're ready to let them have more. And at the end of this, you might end up with a habitat mix of a pasture that was grazed hard for the full season. So that's going to be short habitat. You're going to have a pasture that was only grazed for like the latter half of the season, maybe. And then a third pasture that maybe you grazed at the end of the season, or maybe you didn't, depending on whether you needed it or not. And you've got at least one pasture or more pastures that haven't been grazed at all. And so the result of that looks something like this. This is just one example. This is actually from my personal family prairie, where we've been doing a bunch of restoration work for a lot of years. And what you can see is that A is the pasture where the cattle have been all season. This is an August photo from a couple of years ago. So A has been grazed all season. B, the cows came in the last half of the season. C was the pasture we were going to use if we needed it toward the end of the season. We didn't end up needing it that year, so it's tall and thatchy. And then D is 1 year out from being pasture A, right? So pasture D a year ago was grazed all season. The year before it was grazed for the last half of the season. So it's had a year and a half of very intense grazing. And the year of this photo, it's been rested, and it's sort of in that same kind of party of opportunistic plants stage, where in this case, there's a lot of Western ragweed, but also stiff goldenrod and a whole bunch of other things you can't see in this photo that sort of flush for a year or so, but then a year later, it looks like pasture C, where you don't see that ragweed abundance, and the grasses have kind of come back and taken over. And I don't want to harp on data. I want to show you a little bit of data. And the point that I want you to pay attention to here is what we're looking at is 4 pastures in 2017, which is the top graph, and 2018, which is the bottom graph. And the two things I want you to pay attention to are that within a year, there's a lot of difference between pastures in terms of each of these measures. And then those measures look different in the following year. So it might be low in the first year and high in the second year, or vice versa, right? So that's the shifting part of this mosaic. There's a mosaic of different habitats in 2017. And in 2018, there's also a mosaic of habitats, but it's different. Everything's in a different place. So this is forb cover. This is the amount of standing dead that's out there. And this is the average height of vegetation. So in both cases, you have 4 different patches of those habitats, and then in the following year, they're each in different places. That's the point of habitat heterogeneity in a shifting mosaic approach. So how does this affect plant diversity? Because that's really important, right? That's a piece of the resilience that we talked about. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these graphs, but I just wanted to show you, I want to show you that we're actually tracking things. So we're testing these methods. This is actually on a patch burn graze site rather than an open gate grazing. The blue in this graph is the site that's been grazed, and the orange is an ungrazed 9-acre exclosure out in the corner. This is not a perfect system. It's not a replicated research project. It was a way that we set this up to see if we would be comfortable with the way the grazing versus the ungrazed looks. So the ungrazed still gets burned on the same frequency as the grazed, but it doesn't have any cattle on it. And basically what's happening is the two sites started out pretty similar in terms of their species richness at a square meter scale. Over time, the grazed area becomes more species rich, and the ungrazed stays about the same. But they're both doing fine, right? One is not necessarily better than the other. They're both okay. The key point for us was we wanted to make sure we weren't having a negative impact on species diversity. And then we also did this with floristic quality. So we did floristic quality at a square meter scale and then averaged that across the site in both the grazed and the ungrazed. And again, in this case, very little difference. They started out where the ungrazed were a little higher. It's still a little higher at the end, but not significantly. And then we can look at individual species. And what's fun is they all respond a little bit differently to grazing. So Maximilian sunflower is doing better in the ungrazed site, but still doing just fine in the grazed. Illinois bundleflower is the same. Stiff sunflower is pretty much exactly the same between grazed and ungrazed. It doesn't really matter. And purple prairie clover is the abundance of this species is low enough that's hard to see significance here, but it tends to do a little bit better in the grazed area than the ungrazed over time. But again, none of this is better or worse. It's just there's some differences between species responses. And this is where it's interesting to talk about trade-offs, right? Because if you really care about Illinois bundleflower, you probably would want to not manage the site the way we're managing it if you want to maximize bundleflower production. But if you just like bundleflower as part of a community, it's still in the system in the grazed area. It may be declining, and it'll be really important to keep watching that particular species, because right now, if you look at the last 7 years or so, it looks like maybe it's moving in a direction that's steadily down, and then maybe it'll disappear altogether. I don't think that's going to happen based on experience, but it's definitely something we're watching. But on the other hand, if you like purple prairie clover, the grazing system that we're using might be better. So if you're trying to optimize prairie clover habitat, maybe the grazing system is better. But what I'm really hoping to do with this management is to have both species and all the other species around. And if they're less abundant or more abundant, it's less important to me than the fact that they're still part of the community and that they can respond when they're called upon or when the community needs them to play a particular role. So that's where the trade-offs are really important. Again, it's not a right or wrong sort of thing. It's just what you're comfortable with and what you want to see on your site. Okay, so all of that works for us pretty well, but we have, again, fairly large sites. And not every site makes sense from a grazing standpoint. Not every site makes sense from that shifting mosaic standpoint, because you may not have enough space where you feel like you can do that. So what do you do if you have a small prairie, right? 5 acres, 10 acres, 1 acre. How do you manage a prairie that is that size, but still try to manage to facilitate resilience? And first of all, I don't have all the answers to this, but I made a little handy flow chart that maybe will make it helpful. So the first question is, can you make the prairie bigger? Because that's the best answer, right? If you have a small fragment of a habitat patch, the best thing you can do is to make that bigger or connect it to other sites, because that solves a whole bunch of problems right away. So if you can, that's what you want to do, right? Spend whatever money you can raise to make that happen. But if you can't, you can't. And so you move on. So if you can't do that, what are the other options? One thing is to think about your objectives, right? What is it you want to do with this site? Is there a rare species at this prairie where you really feel like you need to maximize production of that particular species or a group of species? If so, great. That's going to be what you're going to do. Or are you going to try to make this prairie as resilient as possible by trying to maintain the highest diversity you can of both plant and animal species, and hope that resilience is enough that even given its size, it can survive into the future? So if you're managing for rare species, I think that's often going to be a really difficult challenge, but it's not a challenge that's wrong to take on. But I think it's really difficult because, like I said earlier, it's easy to get into a trap where you manage for the habitat structure or for the growing conditions for that particular species, while simultaneously then managing against the needs of a bunch of other species. And over time, you end up potentially simplifying the overall community around that species that you care about in a way that the resilience of the site and the support system for that species could go away. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that is a possibility that you have to really watch for when you're managing for any sort of limited number of species. Versus the other option of trying to manage for the most biodiversity possible, which also isn't easy. But the point would be to do what we've been doing here in some form, right? Managing for a variation of management so that all the species have a chance to thrive either simultaneously or over a period of time. So fire is a great tool for managing prairies, obviously. And in small prairies, it's especially important to make sure that every fire that gets done leaves refuges, unburned refuges behind. And the smaller the site, the more important this is, and probably the bigger the refuges need to be. Because those refuges are where invertebrates are going to survive, but even vertebrates are going to survive, and potentially plant species that are vulnerable to certain kinds of fire regimes can survive as well. And there's no safe time to burn in terms of time of year where you're not going to have an impact on species, right? Burning in the summer is easy to think about because you're going to potentially burn up anything that can't get out of the way of that fire. But burning in the dormant season is also really risky for species because there's a lot of things that are overwintering, for example, above ground, either in the thatch layer or burrowed inside stems or seed heads or something above ground. So anything that burns up that habitat is going to burn up the species that are in it. So if you have a 5-acre prairie and you burn the whole 5-acre prairie and there's no other habitat surrounding it, it's really likely that whatever gets burned up in that prairie is gone, and maybe for good. So it's really important then to leave some space for some of those species in each of those populations to survive, so the populations kind of continue on from year to year. The other thing with fire is, of course, fire tends to be fairly non-selective. It just burns or it doesn't. But you can change that by changing the intensity of the fire, burning on a more humid day, for example, or doing some mowing or something to knock down the vegetation and structure and change the intensity of the fire. Maybe in some places where it'll leave some habitat behind, it'll just burn in a patchy way rather than a roaring fire all the way through it. And you can change the season of fire, right? Burn patches in the spring versus the summer versus the fall versus the winter. And maybe if you want to burn half to 2/3 of the site in a particular year, maybe you do that in 2 different burns at different times a year and kind of spread the risk and the opportunities out across a season. And then if you're mowing or haying a site, if that's one of the management tools you have, the refuges thing still applies. Still really important to leave refuges. And for the same reasons we talked about with fire, but I'll give you another example with hay, and especially if you're managing for pollinators, or if you're managing for diversity where pollinators is an important piece of that. If you have a 20-acre prairie or a 10-acre prairie and you hay that entire prairie, you've just destroyed the universe for some of the really small bees, for example, that are relying on the floristic resources in that area. And if you're a single mom bee, if you're a solitary bee, which is basically just a single mom with a nest, you're limited to your flight range away from that nest in terms of where you can get food. And if all the food within that range disappears, then you die and your nest dies, and you've lost that whole investment. So leaving refuges is important for a lot of different things. But then, just like fire, and even more than fire, you can do a lot of variations with mowing. The first one, by the way, is the height. So if you're mowing, you don't have to mow all the way to the ground. You can mow at high or low or different heights, and you can change that across the site as you mow to leave some areas higher or lower. And obviously, you can vary the timing. So just like with fire, if you feel like you need to mow half to 2/3 of a site in a year, you could do it all at once, or you could do it over a series of different timing, and vary the structure that way. And then the last one is that you don't have to mow big patches. You can be really creative. You can make trails. You can mow little patches here and there and create openings within a taller habitat patch. You can, mow zigzags, anything you want to do. Think about the animals and the species that you're trying to manage for, and create some different patterns with a mower and have fun with it. It doesn't have to be just big blocks. And then the last thing is, boy, small sites and brush management is really challenging, especially if you're surrounded by, sources of tree and brush encroachment, because it just keeps coming in. And it's hard to create like a core area that's open and then maintain that, because the whole thing is edge habitat, basically, or at least potentially in some sites where you're just always fighting that influx of shrubs. So it's not that it can't be done, but it can be really difficult. And back to trade-offs for a minute here, you might have some really serious trade-off decisions to make, because you might feel like you need to mow or burn really frequently to keep shrub encroachment down. But you also know that if you mow or burn too frequently, especially across the whole site, you're going to lose a lot of the species of animals, especially that you're trying to manage for, and you're going to shift the plant community in a certain way, which may or may not be what you want. But again, if you make the decision that we need to mow or burn frequently because if we don't, we lose this thing to shrub encroachment, that's not necessarily the wrong decision. That could be the right decision. You just have to recognize the trade-off and make the best decision you can. Managing small prairies is really challenging. So I'm going to end a little early because I'd like to have some time for discussion and questions. But just as a quick recap, if you want ecological resilience, the most important thing is habitat protection. That's a different topic than what we're talking about here. if you can restore habitat, make small fragmented landscapes less fragmented, and make patches bigger and more connected, that's a really good thing to do. And then habitat management, what we just talked about, managing for diversity, managing for those pillars of ecological resilience is really important. So I'm going to stop there. Here's some of my contact information. Prairie Ecologist is the blog that I write. Very heavy on photography, but also restoration management ideas and suggestions and thoughts. I'm on Instagram at Prairie Ecologist also, and then the Nature Conservancy's website is nature.org, and you can go to the Nebraska page to see things that I'm working on. But I'm going to stop sharing, and we'll see if my video works better than it did last time, and we can do questions.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, your video stayed working lovely the whole time. So
well, good.
So we're good. Got several questions here in the chat.
Good.
Let's start off with Carolyn. She asked, what are your thoughts on the schedule of burning, haying or mowing, resting, and altering this process every 3 years on a prairie restoration area?
Yeah, I think that's a good general approach. I mean, the timing and the frequency it all is going to really depend on your local conditions and what you need to do, right? If you're fighting shrub encroachment and mowing is your best strategy, you might need to mow more often than every 3 years. Or you might decide that you can mow every 4 or 5 years and still be okay. But I think the most important thing would be to not get into a set pattern. In other words, don't just set a 3-year rotation and leave it. Because a 3-year rotation, there are species that will adapt well to that 3-year rotation. They're really conditioned to that and they'll thrive. And there are other species that won't do well. And I've seen a lot of prairies that are on a 3-year fire or mowing schedule where the things that best adapt themselves to that are things like smooth brome and smooth sumac. And they become more and more dominant and they can really start to hurt the prairie. So I think it can be really important to vary that schedule, partly based on what you see, right? Adapting your management to what's happening. But also, I think just as a general rule, it's good to not have a set schedule of any kind and have a little bit of randomness or chaos or variation thrown in there so that nothing gets sort of too accustomed to a particular management regime.
Yeah, nice. Let's see. Tracy asks, do you have a resource that summarizes how species respond to the grazed versus ungrazed conditions?
I mean, the actual answer is no. I don't know of anything where it's all in one place, partly because it's really challenging. Grazing is not grazing is not grazing. And so reading research about grazing is complicated because a lot of studies tend to say we're going to compare an ungrazed site to a grazed site, but then they don't hold the grazing standardized. They have some areas that are intensively grazed, some are rotationally grazed, some are season-long grazed. And so you're not comparing, it's not a fair comparison. And then if you compare one study of grazed versus ungrazed to another study of grazed versus ungrazed, you can only compare them if the grazing was the same kind of grazing, right? And so it's really hard to just look at the literature and say, well, what species of plants do well in a grazed situation versus not, because it just depends on the grazing situation. I would say in our grazing experience, and this is both in the Platte River prairies in Nebraska, so sort of south central, but also in the Sandhills in Nebraska, which is very different. We're not seeing grazing eliminate any plant species. We are seeing some plants that do better in no grazing, and then hang on in a lower level of abundance. And I'll give you some examples of that. There are species like common milkweed, which people don't think about milkweed as something that cows would eat because it's got that sticky, toxic latex in it. But both cattle and bison really like milkweed. So it's thought-provoking to think historically about when we had bison grazing on a large scale, what kind of abundance common milkweed was in and where it was found, because what my experience is that bison will seek it out and destroy it any chance they get. So the way it probably survived was with this shifting mosaic approach, where if part of the landscape was burned by people, that's where the bison would be spending their time, and they wouldn't be grazing very intensively on these unburned areas. And that's where the milkweed would have a few years to do well until it got burned, and then they'd get eaten, and then have to come back again. But anyway, so common milkweed, for us, rosinweed, Silphium integrifolium, is a species that cattle really like to eat. And so we have lower populations of that where we have some kind of grazing versus where we have no grazing. Canada milkvetch is another one. There's a series of those. But again, the key point is we're not seeing any of those species disappear. They're just at lower abundances. So it becomes a question of trade-offs, and we just have to decide, is it more important to have a variation of habitat and maybe have a higher animal diversity, or is it more important to focus on these particular species? Because both could be good answers.
And you mentioned fire, so I'm going to jump to another question someone had related to kind of that same question, but instead of for grazing, about resources, summarizing how different species respond to fire and fire frequency.
And it's almost the exact same question because dormant season fire versus growing season fire is very different. Fire frequencies are very different from each other, and so it can be really difficult to just summarize that. And it really varies geographically. One of the things that I'm most interested in learning, and we haven't figured this out yet, is why in eastern tallgrass prairies, so eastern Missouri or Illinois, I guess, Illinois, Wisconsin especially is where I see this, frequent fire, annual fire, seems to really stimulate forb diversity and forb abundance. But in more western tallgrass prairies or mixed grass prairies, frequent fire tends to favor grass dominance. I don't know why that is. I have ideas, I have hypotheses, but I don't know why that is. And so again, if you're looking at research on how fire impacts things, it really depends on whether you're talking about eastern tallgrass prairie or more western prairies. And it depends on whether it's a restored prairie or remnant prairie, and what the history is, and what kind of fire you're using, all these things. I'm sorry to give a frustrating answer, but that is kind of the answer.
There's just no easy answers there, right?
Yeah.
Let's see. Julie asks, what's the biggest challenge in introducing grazing to a prairie?
Probably infrastructure. You have to have some kind of fence to keep them in, and you have to have some kind of water facility to give them water. And then the other thing is just, getting used to what a grazed prairie looks like, because aesthetically it's going to be very different, right? And not everybody likes that aesthetic, and that's okay. So it depends on whether you're trying to convince stakeholders or neighbors or bosses that grazing is okay. That can also be a challenge, just getting everybody used to the fact that it's going to be very different than what it was. But the infrastructure is a big thing. And that's where, again, it doesn't always work for small sites, because infrastructure is expensive and it may not be cost effective to, put in a bunch of fence and water facilities and then, graze a 5-acre prairie. And then the other thing is sometimes it can be hard to find somebody to graze it for you, because in my landscape, there's lots of people looking for places to graze their cattle, but that's not true everywhere. So it can be hard to find somebody who's A, willing to come bring cattle to your site, and B, willing to graze it in the way that you want to graze it, right? Because you want to make sure that you're setting the grazing schedules. This is when I want them. This is where I want them. This is when I want them gone. And it can be hard to find somebody that'll work with you on that in some places.
Sure. All right. So here's let's see. Tammy's asking, how long do you think one should wait on a fledgling prairie before overseeding? She goes, theirs is 3 years old, and we're seeing something new every year right now.
Yeah.
So the grasses seem to be a little slow coming in.
I think I would wait quite a while, because you can see those prairies often continue to change dramatically for the first 5 to 10 years, even in my experience, at least before they start to settle into a pattern. A lot of times on our sites on the Platte, for example, we'll start grazing them about year 7, because that's about when we feel like the grasses are starting to become pretty dominant, and they're starting to have sort of they're starting to act as a governor on forb abundance or diversity. And so our grazing can kind of help reduce the dominance of those grasses periodically and allow some of those other wildflowers to do well. But that tells you a little bit about restoration from our standpoint, because it takes 7 years for those to mature, but we're also using light seeding rates, and that's going to be different maybe than yours. But I also, I mean, there are plant species that show up in a restoration that I won't see for the first 5 years, and then I start seeing it again. Um, and then the last piece I would say is in terms of overseeding. I mean, if it's a prairie restoration that goes well, you probably shouldn't have to overseed, right? You hope that you get everything in at the beginning. Um, but also you can use management to sort of push it in a direction that you want to go. So if you feel like you don't have a lot of your cool season native grasses doing well or sedges, or if you feel like there's some wildflowers that aren't doing well, you can manage in certain ways to try to favor those species and try to bring up their abundance over time. Figure out what's limiting them in terms of competition or site conditions or whatever, and see what you can do to help that out. So overseeding might be a piece of the puzzle, but it doesn't necessarily have to be.
Okay. All right. What is your recommendation for battling a well-established dogwood patch in the middle of a remnant prairie?
Yeah, good luck. Actually, no, I do have some ideas on this, but I don't have a solution, but I have ideas. Kansas State has done some really cool stuff in the last 5 or 10 years with this idea, because they've got a big brush problem at Konza Prairie, for example, and we've done a lot of work with a bunch of people that are trying different things. And I think the first key is that usually people have best success with multiple strategies at the same time, right? So just mowing is less effective than mowing plus burning. Or herbicide work, if you wanted to use herbicides is usually less effective by itself than it is in combination with either fire or mowing. So not that you have to use herbicides or mowing or fire, but if you have a couple different ideas, using them in combination usually is more successful. The next thing I would say is that we've been learning the last several years that cattle grazing has a much bigger impact on dogwood than we thought it did. And we've learned that because we've changed up our management in a couple places where we're grazing in different ways. And all of a sudden the dogwood is growing in a way that it hadn't for the previous 10 or 15 years. And so, browsing animals like goats and deer get all the attention in terms of shrub control. But there are other animals that are eating shrubs, including bison, but cattle much more than bison. And so if you have grazing as part of your system, it might be useful to look at burning those dogwood and then letting cattle in to graze for a while, and they'll graze the fresh regrowth of those dogwood plants. And you get, again, it's a combination of treatments. So that's probably my best advice. I think we're still trying to figure out timing and frequency of mowing and all those sorts of things. But try multiple things at the same time and see if that helps. And good luck, because we're all fighting the same thing.
Let me glance through here. I think I've gotten all the questions that people tapped in, but let's see. Yep, I think I got them all. I do. If anyone's finishing typing up, I'll give you just a second. But I wanted to say I loved your talking about, as land managers, we don't need to fix the natural world; just have to keep it operational, keep the lights on. I like that.
Well, I'm glad you think so. It took me a long time to come to that realization, I think, because, I know that in my head, I know that nature always changes and that there isn't an end point, right? But I also feel like we put ourselves under a lot of pressure that there's always new invasive species coming in. There's all these new challenges. And so we feel like we're not solving the old challenges. We get faced with new challenges. The prairies are always changing. We got climate change, all these things happening. And all of that is true, but also just keep it moving, right? We come up with new ways of dealing with invasive species all the time. Some invasives that used to be bad are not nearly as bad now because we've come up with biocontrol strategies, or we've just learned how to deal with them, or like predators have come in, or there are natural sort of systems that have come in and made them less dominant than they were before. So some of those things take care of themselves over time. And it's just not worth stressing out about it as much as I have in the past. It's still a stressful job.
Yeah.
But yeah, so anyway, I'm glad that resonates with you.
Yep.
It's been helpful for me too.
It's that combination of we need to do stuff now and I have to be patient, which is a hard combination.
And I have never met anyone in land management who feels like they have all the resources they need to do the job right. Like we all feel under resourced. We don't have enough people, equipment, time, all those sorts of things. I think that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
But it's because all of us want it to be better than it is now, and there's never a good enough, which is good. That's fine to aim that way, but it's also really good to step back and say, okay, it's still there. It's okay. It'll be fine. The next people will figure out some of these other things.
Exactly. It's always a learning curve there. Well, thank you so much, Chris. If anybody does have extra questions, you want to spend a little one-on-one time with Chris, his office hours are right at 4, so you can hop on to that session. Don't forget to fill out your evaluation for the session. And then, again, the session will be on the app for the entire year. So you feel free to hop back on and re-listen if you've missed part of it or you had to hop on a little late or something. So thank you everyone for your time and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks, everybody.